Hello, and thank you all for joining us for tonight's Bull session. Whether you are joining here on webinar with all of us or live on YouTube, it is a pleasure to have you all. My name is Nathan Winkelstein. I am the Associate Artistic Director of Red Bull Theater. And tonight's Bull session is going to focus on the theatrical adaptation of Paradise Lost that Michael Barakiva adapted from the poem by Milton. We at Red Bull have produced it in two parts over two different Mondays in April. The second part of that was done this last Monday and is still available to be viewed on the Red Bull website or on our YouTube page until tomorrow at 7 p.m., at which point it disappears for all time. So if somehow you are here and have not watched that, you have until tomorrow at 7 p.m. to watch the second part. For those of you who are on the webinar, this is an active Q&A. The way to engage with that is if you look at the bottom of your webinar screen, you have a Q&A function as well as a hand raise function. The Q&A function can be used by itself. Type a question in, I will see it. I will try to get to as many as I can. You will not see other people's questions. They are asking, so don't feel like you are talking into a void. You are talking into an active discussion. That said, please do ask questions, because sometimes nobody asks questions, and then that makes my job hard. If you are interested in asking the question in your own voice, you can type it into the Q&A and then click the raise hand as well. If you do that as well, and if I come to your question, then I will unmute you and you can ask the question in your own voice. If you are on YouTube, you're out of luck. For the next one of these, please do join us here on the webinar. Great. So that is enough for me. Let me introduce our panelists tonight. We have the adapter and director himself, the wonderful Michael Barakiva. We have Red Bull's resident dramaturg and dramaturg on this project, Kathleen Dimmick, and one of the wonderful actors from this last Monday's reading, as well as from the initial reading of this project, Carol Halstead. Thanks, Carol and Kathleen and Michael. If you can, Kathleen, if you can join us. And hello, all. Thank you for joining this evening and for volunteering your time to answer some questions and to talk even more about Paradise Lost. So let me get this started by handing it off to you, Michael, because this is your baby, and it's been. Maybe it's more of a adolescent by now. I'm not entirely certain, but could you tell us just a little bit about when it first occurred to you that you would want to dramatize Paradise Lost, and just a little bit about the process and the journey this project has been on?
Sure. Thanks, Nathan. I have a really long history with this poem, which is also funny because I am somebody who loves literature but does not read verse easily, but loves verse drama. And I'm sure some of this has to do with the fact that English is my second language. I was born in Israel, and Hebrew is my first language, and I think it makes accessing verse a little bit more difficult for me in some ways. So I was an English drama double major at Vassar College, but studied almost no poetry. And in my senior year, I took a King Lear class with Anne Imbrie, an extraordinary woman who passed away around 15 years ago. She was the chair of the department. We spent the entire semester on King Lear. And then in spring of my senior year, she invited me to this 24-hour reading of Paradise Lost that took place in the chapel. That was an annual event, and invited me to read for a small portion of it. And I sat in the back of the chapel and listened to this poem, and I was just swept away by the beauty of the language and the extraordinary intricacy and sophistication of the thought. And so years and years later, when my husband and I were planning our wedding, I realized I couldn't take any work that would conflict with the wedding or the honeymoon. And this was really upsetting to me. So in December of 2012, I sent an email to 40 of my favorite actors. And for some reason that I still don't totally understand, sending this email was one of the most terrifying things I'd ever done in my life. And I wrote to them and I said, hi, let's adapt Paradise Lost. And a bunch of them showed up, and we were working at Juilliard, my alma mater at the time, on Sundays. We met every other week, and we would just read a book and sort of cut it down. And we weren't adapting it into a play at the time. We were just cutting it, just trying to like get the sense of it clearer. And after a few weeks, some of the actors, I think Carol, I think you were one of them, some of the actors said, well, what are we going to do? We're adapting this. What are we going to do? And I surprised myself by saying we should raise $10,000 and then present it in one day as an event with 2 full meal breaks. And the words came out of my mouth, but I had no idea I was going to say them. They surprised, like sin coming out of Lucifer's brain. They just emerged. And the actor said, oh, that's a great idea. And so we did it. We raised $10,000. And 2 weeks before I got married, we did it was a 13-hour event in a church in Brooklyn. And the company not only performed the event, but cooked 2 full meals. We did a full tea was our first one. It was a high and a low tea, a full tea. A lot of people think high tea is the fancy tea, but that's not true. High tea is the more casual tea because the workers would stand up while they were taking it. It's traditionally the savory tea. The low tea is actually considered the more elegant tea because the ladies would sit and have little desserts. And then we got a roasted pig and made some quinoa and vegetables. And it was just this sort of amazing event. And a theater company called the Upstart Creatures was born out of that event, and the Upstarts still exist. And we do events. Carol's one of our founding members and one of the anchors of that company. And the president of Red Bull attended that event. He was one of the 15 audience members who stayed for the entire 13 hours. And I think, Jesse Berger, the Red Bull AD, called me a few weeks later and said, Howard won't stop talking about it. Tell me about the model. I said, well, the model is extraordinary artistically, but it's a disaster financially. We just spent $10,000. But Jesse, I've had the privilege of knowing Jesse for 20 years now, over 20 years, and we would run into each other and chat about it. And a few years ago, I think encouraged by 2 board members, both Howard and Anne, who has a deep and passionate love for the poem, he approached me and he said, what do you think a theatrical adaptation would look like? And that was maybe 3 years ago, and that was the birth of the readings that happened this month.
Michael, you're leaving out the period where you tried to make it into a musical.
Oh, that's right. That's right. We took a bunch of the Upstart Creatures, took a retreat to the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center and spent 5 amazing days. And I have all of the notes. And if there is a composer lyricist listening to this who wants to make this into a musical with us, we know exactly how to do it.
We have 2 fat books, right?
Yeah. Oh, we have it all. We have I Want numbers. We have community numbers. We have it all. We are ready to go.
So the transition from a 13-hour event at a church to a 4.5, I'd say, hours of text, 4 hours of text, for that we did over these last 2 Mondays. That's we're not great at math and theater, but that's a lot. That's like a third of where we were at before. So there was a secondary major adaptation and major haul for you to go on over the last few years. And Kathleen, I know that you were tagged for this process at some point to help out as Red Bull's resident dramaturg. What was your experience like, both working with Michael on adapting this play and trying to figure out what third of Paradise Lost to keep to still tell the story?
Well, that was really Michael's doing. By the time I came in, he had created much of part 1. And my function really, I think, was to look at how the piece was moving structurally, what it would seem to want to be, how that story would want to be told in part 1, would want to be told in part 2. I think he got a lot of work done on part 2 because of the pandemic. And then in preparation for each new draft. It would also, from the larger structural movement of each piece, then even just on the basic level of language, because I think I probably read portions of this poem in college. That's 50 years ago. So Michael was educating me about the poem, and then I would reflect back to him particular language conundrums, language problems or challenges that as an audience member that we might want to do, that we might need some help with. And so I think on that larger structural level and on the smaller language level, those were the two ways I could most assist Michael. And it was a delightful process for me.
Kathleen, like most dramaturgs, I think portrays her role with less stage time than it actually had, because especially working as adaptor and director, her presence was invaluable as, just constantly asking the kind of questions that opened possibilities rather than closed them. And she said, what is this section about? How do we realize this theme? What is the story here? What is the event here? What does the language mean? And how can we make it clearer? And I can't also undervalue how much care Red Bull took with the process, because hearing it every now and then, we would hear it read out loud by a wonderful company of actors, many of whom were in the presentations this month. And hearing the words, it's like I'm starting a company to help novelists develop their work using new play development tools, because hearing words is so different than reading them on the page. And I was struck by that every time a company of actors would speak the words to me. So I'd say the first 2.5 years I worked on it, my goal was not to change Milton's text at all. Like, I changed it structurally and I put it into chronological order, but my goal was to take the text as far as it could possibly take us. And then when it couldn't take us any further, the wonderful playwright and actor Kate Hamill did one of our in-house readings, and she said to me, you've just got to take it. And it was such a helpful, freeing, because I needed somebody to give me permission to say thank you to Milton, and then to take it to the next level. So even though the text is still 95% Milton, it's the 5% that isn't that I think makes the difference from it being a rearranged poem to a theatrical event.
We have our first question, and audience, we have only one, and there's 58 of you.
Yeah, you can do better.
Yeah, the director says you can do better. Now I'm going to get like 72 questions. So we only have one so far, so come at us. But the first question, I like this question because I actually don't know the answer, and there's a compliment for our actor built in, which is Marianne Segerman asks, was it Milton who viewed sin as a sexy woman?
I think it was Carol Halstead.
And is that true? I actually don't know. Speaking as someone who hasn't read the poem in and of itself, is sin not really described? How is sin described in the poem?
Sin comes out of his head and says the words. I mean, well, I don't think there's any description, is there?
There are two funny things with sin. The first thing is that all of the beginning of our adaptation, which takes place in heaven, we hear recounted as a story later on in the poem, because the poem, like many epic poems, is structured. It begins in medias res. So we hear sin tells Satan her origin story when he encounters her. And part of our joy was getting to take that accounting and make it into an actual scene. So she emerges from Lucifer's head fully formed, and it's supposed to sort of reference Athena's birth from Zeus's head, from the classical mythology that of course Milton would have been familiar with. But the great part is that she emerges as this beautiful, sexy temptress, and then after the rebel angels have fallen and she is sent to be the gatekeeper to the hell's gates, she's described as a woman naked from the waist up, but as a serpent from the waist down. And she has this sort of beautiful transformation. And for those of you who saw the reading, you'll see that all of Carol's costumes, were courtesy of Carol Halstead Productions. Like, she has great ideas about how to realize things. And one of the joys about, working with, Carol, you and I have been working together for a decade with some regularity, is that I just trust her to say, do something extraordinary, and I know it will be.
So we have another question, which was actually one I was going to bring up if it didn't get asked. So I'm glad it's here. There was a comment that I had not heard about this until the comment sections for our readings are some of the best television around. And there was a comment there that is being reiterated here by an anonymous attendee who's asking the director, adapter, and dramaturg to discuss more about your work on the structure and language, adapting it into a real play with dramatic drive, and how that might relate to Jacobean revenge tragedy, or the plays of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Because am I correct, not to jump the gun a little bit, that Paradise Lost was based on a revenge tragedy, or was that it was commented that way in the comments, so it must be true?
Well, Kathleen, you want to take it?
Yeah, I don't know that it was based on a Jacobean revenge tragedy, but I will say that Michael and I had a very interesting discussion on Tuesday after Monday's reading, in which we were talking about the two parts. And Michael had the somewhat radical notion of condensing part two even further. It's shorter than part one, but condensing it even further. And then we were thinking about what that made us think about the two parts, and part one as being more of a big Shakespearean war play, like I was thinking, like, Henry V combined with Richard III. And then part two is more of a chamber play, focused much more on Adam and Eve and their journey with Satan. And that's one of the benefits of doing something like this, a reading like this, because you're able to get a sense of maybe where the thing could go next or wants to go next. And so I thought that was a very interesting way to start thinking about part two in a way I hadn't thought of myself.
Yeah, I think in the poem, Satan is the protagonist for the first half, and then Adam becomes the protagonist for the second half. So when we adapted into a play in part one, The Fall of Lucifer, we really wanted it to be about Lucifer and Satan. And because of how we restructured it chronologically, we get to meet Lucifer and then see the rebel angels, their fall, and him becoming Satan, which is a very interesting story. In the poem starts with Satan waking up in hell, and then we hear the backstory around halfway through. In our version, it also felt one of the few times that I really actively worked against the text of Milton is that the text is deeply sexist and misogynistic, as is much of Christianity. And so with many of the actors, and with Kathleen, and with many of the female identifying actors, and specifically with Gisela Cipe, who I've also been working with for a decade, we really worked on rooting out the sexism and the misogyny as it appeared, because telling the story through that lens felt really destructive right now. And in fact, many of the company members talked about how this was a story that they had experienced growing up, as a story about how women are bad and women are sinful. And it felt so important to not do that. So I gave a lot of Adam's text. I saw this question in the chat box also. I gave a lot of Adam's text to Eve to increase her agency and the size of the part. And I tried to focus specifically on the text about intellectuality and curiosity, so that when Eve is the one that bites the apple first, I think it is born out of the fact that she's much more curious than Adam is, who's sort of more sedate and more stays in the status quo more easily.
And to go, just because you answered part of the question, and just to continue this, like, how does one dramatize a poem? There's another question about kind of the translation from third person to first person of a lot of what is going on, which obviously makes sense when you have actors. And I know that there was a narrator character, sort of, who was around for a while. Someone who was sort of reading, where the stage directions was almost its own person. And you ended up figuring out that you didn't need that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like figuring out how to get all of this description into what people are saying?
Well, something Kathleen was really helpful about was encouraging me to, like not to use a framing device, which I had been thinking about for a while, not to avoid anything that would make it feel collegiate or narrative in that way. And when I was the artistic director of The Hanger, we commissioned an original Christmas Carol that was done by Aisha Stratford, who's an excellent Australian-American playwright. And she felt passionately that there should be no narration until the very, very, very end. And then Scrooge sort of turns to the audience in the last moment and he finishes the play. And the convention worked so successfully that I copied it in our adaptation of Paradise Lost. So we have God has a little prologue, which has grown a little bit. And then Satan occasionally functions as narrator in the way that like a rascal or a rogue in a play can sort of slyly look through the fourth wall with a peephole and remind the audience that they are the character who's aware that is a performance. But where the biggest challenge is that the narrator's voice in the poem not only has a lot of the most beautiful text, but the voice itself is profoundly different than the voice of every character in the poem. So anytime we would take narration and make it into dialogue, it would actually need like a facelift to get into the voice of the person speaking it.
Carol, I know we have a lot of questions, but I do want to, because of course, you as an actor, having dealt with the 13-hour to the 4-hour and having been involved kind of along the way in a lot of our test runs of this, can you speak a little bit to the experience as an actor taking this text that was maybe originally designed to be a narrative voice and incorporating it and making it active the way an actor has to? Could you speak a little to that, what the challenges, what the successes were of that?
Sure. And when we began in that 13-hour reading of the play Just Cut Down, it felt like we were reading a poem. Do you know, I mean, we were very close to being reverential to the language. And as the play became more shaped and pared down, and Michael found what characters the narrative really wanted to be told from, each rendition became more and more actable because it became somehow more personalized. Each angel, each loyal angel, each fallen angel. And we began to feel, just from paring it down and what he just said about making it more specific to that character, then you thought, oh, this isn't just a line of a poem. This is a person. Who is this person? Do you know, and that question about sin, was she written as a sexy woman? You as an actor, you read these lines and you say, well, like, what does it mean to be sin? What if I'm sin? How do I embody that? What makes me feel, that way? And I think everybody, did that on their own. And Michael, at a certain point with this reading, said, don't pull back, go for the largeness of it, go for the epic quality of it. And I think that gave us permission to personalize it in the grand scale of Milton's text. Does that make sense?
It makes a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, it does offer a follow-up, and I think there's a few questions that are kind of dancing around this. I was just hearing what you were saying about how, like, with some writing, when you start reading it as an actor, you very quickly go into like almost pontification because there's no real character there. So you end up just kind of going into like, I guess I'll just say it clean. And so I guess I have a question going back to Michael. Someone here is helping me with what I tried to say about the Revenger's tragedy, which is not that it was based on a Revenger's tragedy, but that it was originally thought of by Milton. as a drama, which then turned into an epic poem. Was that? And so did you find reading it that the characters speak in their own voices, or is Milton more one of those poets where everyone kind of speaks in his voice, but his voice is really charismatic?
Well, I think that most of the characters have, well, I think, let's see, God has a very clear voice, as does the sun. The loyal angels do not have very distinct voices. And I think part of the actors' great triumph was finding their individual voices. And it's a very interesting comment, I think, also from Milton, that the loyal angels don't have a lot of individual character. Adam and Eve certainly do. But and yes, it was originally imagined, Milton thought about writing it as a play, decided not to write it as a play. And a lot of my work was taking these huge monologues and cutting them down and intersplicing them to make them appear as dialogue, which they're not. It's sort of like a page and a half monologue, a page and a half monologue. And I would take chunks out and try to intersplice them. But it is very interesting in terms of history and language, because Shakespeare writes until the early 17th century, overlapping, of course, with Jacobean drama and revenger's tragedy. Then the Puritans take over and all the theaters are closed. And Milton was somebody who believed passionately in democracy and in the Republic. And this poem is born out of his attempt to reconcile why democracy is good on earth, but monarchy is good in heaven. And it is a very complicated attempt to try to make sense of those seemingly impossible things. And because they are seemingly impossible, one of my favorite parts of the poem is that oxymoron and paradox lie at its heart. So all the time in the poem, there is this thing. They will use phrases like awful goodness, or life from death and death from life, joy from pain and pain from joy. And he's trying to do this impossible thing in language.
Thank you. I don't even have a follow-up. That was so succinct. That was so but I do, and we're starting to get some amazing questions. So I will move forward from there. But this is a great, we've kind of talked big scope. This is a more kind of actor beat question. An anonymous attendee asks, says that they noticed a parallel between the romantic and yet paternal relationship between Satan and sin, and the same thing between Adam and Eve. Is this something that you specifically highlighted either in your adaptation or in your direction, or is that a new thought to y'all too right now?
I would not characterize Adam and Eve's relationship as paternal, but Satan and sin, he is both her father and her lover.
Yeah, I mean, but one could certainly make the metaphoric argument that just as sin comes out of the head of Satan, Eve comes out of the rib of Adam. So there is a
sure, and there is certain, like in the origin story, but I think the language makes it really clear. And in fact, after Adam bites the apple and he's complaining to God and trying to shirk his responsibility, he says, "Did you not bring her here to be my partner, my co-equal?" And so although the origin certainly references the same origin as sin as Satan, I think the relationship is really designed to be that, especially in our adaptation, what we're hoping to do is to present two equals.
Yeah, and I'd just add to that Michael's ambition here was in part by giving Eve a lot more, as we say, agency, a lot more of Adam's text, was to create two co-equals, meaning they both sin, they both are punished, they both repent, and they both seek redemption. So it's not that one is the temptress who seduces the other into sin, but that the agency goes both ways. And I think that was of concern to Michael, and his adaptation reflects that.
And Michael, you mentioned Anne, our wonderful, our wonderful supporter and incredible dramaturg and scholar in her own right, Anne MacDonald. She wrote a little while back that Macbeth is the ancestor of Satan. So,
well, it's funny. A lot of like when you think about who is the right actor to portray this impossible role, it is much like, much like in the Scottish play, when you're like the role, and it's also that, we were so lucky to have Jason Butler Harner, who is such an extraordinary performer, but it is in the way that very few pieces of literature are. It is truly, like the Scottish play, about evil. It is about the concept of evil. And one of Christianity's great contributions to the philosophical dialogue of the time is this idea that we're born with sin, that we are not born innocent and learn it. It is part of our heritage and something that we have to wrestle with. And I remember when I was younger being so disturbed by that, like it felt so horrible. But in another way, when you look at the atrocities that our species is capable of committing to ourselves, to each other, to the world, it also makes a kind of weird sense. I don't know. It feels less far-fetched to me now than it did when I was younger.
Is there a plan? Two people have similar questions. Is there a plan, Michael, to bring this to a stage? And if so, I'd also be curious, Carol, having been part of all of these versions, I'd also be curious about her take on this. How would you do it? How would you stage this? Because obviously Zoom is its own thing with its own limitations, but also has its own advantages to some extent in terms of epicness. So how would you, and what advantages and disadvantages of a stage versus what you just did?
Well, the first thing is that I would love to bring it to a real stage. And if anybody knows of a theater that wants to do a 12-person, very compact, world premiere adaptation of the greatest poem ever written in this language with title recognition, I hope they reach out to me. Secondly, a real gift of this process with Red Bull has been that over the course of the few years, and I've spoken to Carol and to Kathleen about this, the production, every time I worked on the text, I realized that the production would need less and less. And like a Shakespeare play where the language does all of the work, like I think about those scenes in Julius Caesar when they're like, it's so dark, I can barely see you. And how hilarious that must have been played at 3 p.m. in the afternoon on an outdoor stage in full sun, where they're just telling the audience, this is a scene that takes place at night, but since electricity and electric lights and indoor theater won't be around for another few hundred years, we have to tell you about it. The language does all of the work in Milton. So it's like, we don't need wings. Sin doesn't need a serpent torso because she says, and then I got transformed and now I have this serpentine torso. So I actually feel like the less we do, the more it features the language. And that's what the experience is.
So no crazy makeup for Carol.
Well, if we can afford Carol Halstead Productions, we would love to employ her as a vendor for this production. It would just be something I'd have to discuss with the AD.
That makes sense. So no massive production pieces except for Sin. Sin does get her snake tail, but all made by Carol Productions.
Michael, no flying, no.
Nah, yeah, no, you don't need any of it. The more you do, the less the language is featured. And it's just about the exquisite gorgeousness of these words.
And I will give a peek behind the curtain that Michael did consider actually that this reading would be almost completely audio. That was a choice that was considered artistically for exactly this reason. So he did put his money where his mouth was there.
Totally. I tried to talk Red Bull. I was like, instead of seeing the actor's face, let's just have the text scrolling really slowly as they're speaking it. And probably with great wisdom, they rejected that idea. But,
No, it was great. It was great. No,
I'll also add that it was Michael's first and foremost instruction to the company from the very beginning was that he cares about one thing. He cares about the language being clear. That's what he cares about. And that's what the work was all toward.
Yeah, and we just got lucky. I mean, not lucky. We just got this extraordinary company. We would be remiss without recognizing Dawn Ellen Fraser, who is our voice and speech coach. Somebody I had the pleasure working with years and years ago on a production of Burn This in Shakespeare Santa Cruz, who's in the city now. And I just loved, she just had the best ears. and could work with this extraordinary company that loved language and wanted to share it.
Yeah, and there were also and there was actually quite a few scholars along the way that were helpful in this. I mean, there was obviously Anne MacDonald, who's in the audience. There was I hope I'm not getting the name right. It was Harry Kaplan, is that right? No, I might be getting that wrong. There was a Milton scholar who helped us out. I apologize if I'm forgetting the name.
David Scott Caston.
Yeah,
that's right.
Who has edited the definitive version of this poem that served as a Bible for us, you know, like every time an actor was like, this word doesn't make sense, I would find it in his version. And if it was in there, I'd be like, well, we're going to make sense of it. And if it wasn't, I'd be like, oh, I must have typed it wrong.
Yeah, so there were a lot of people who had a hand in this. It was a very fun process to do. Carolyn J has an interesting question. I'd be curious about this both from a dramaturgical standpoint from the outside and also for you, Michael, as you were building it, of like, you take this poem that is built a certain way to have a certain style and a certain flow, and then you switch it all up to put it into chronological order. How did that affect the structure of the language, the dramatic structure of the story, changing it into the chronological order that you used for the production stuff?
What do you think, Kathleen? Like, how does this feel different and similar to a traditional epic poem that starts in medias res?
It feels completely different, and I think you, whether consciously or unconsciously, you were influenced by the Shakespearean model. And I think you said at one point, or that Milton's writing out of the Shakespeare tradition, so he's got all that in his ear too. And so I think it's fundamental because it changes the entire movement of the piece into something that's dramatic as opposed to something that's epic narration. So your first basic choice was fundamental.
Yeah, and I would say, and I'm reminded that each part of it I have written as a 5-act play, which is the greatest, invocation of the Shakespearean model. It's interesting, this poem was written around 60 years after Shakespeare was writing, 50 to 60 years after Shakespeare was writing. So on the one hand, the language feels more modern and I think makes it easier on the ear. But on the other hand, Jesse Berger, the Red Bull AD, after one of our readings, he gave me such a helpful note, which was that he said it takes Milton 5 lines to do what Shakespeare can do in 2 lines. And that also gave me permission to sort of go in there and do the kind of cutting that I had been resisted doing, which is like, I'm going to cut 3 words here, 4 words there, half a line there, and then stitch the iambic pentameter back together, sort of Frankensteinianly. And when there was a really important thought or a really beautiful thought, sometimes like there's a relationship in verse drama between size of thought and economy of language. And sometimes the only way to preserve the thought would be to insist on a greater economy of language. And as an adapter, that was really terrifying and then became a lot of fun.
Because I do think that there's a slight difference between, maybe a significant difference, between adapting a poem into a play that is then going to be a play versus cutting an extant play, even a massive one, down to a functional piece. I wonder, it's just interesting what you said about the iambic pentameter, because as someone who has cut plays, you try to hold on to it for as long as possible. And then at some point you hit the moment where you're like, I might just cut this line in the middle. That might just happen. Did you do that at all with this? Did you get to that point, or did you try to keep it stitched together into full iambic?
I tried so hard, one of the other reasons that I love this company so much is that when we started this process, and one of the reasons that working with Kathleen was such a gift is that when you are an adapter and a director, you are the playwright and the director, which means that you are really dependent on, I'm also a young adult novelist, and I'm really dependent on my editor. Like, you need outside eyes. Often when you're working with actors like the caliber of the actors who are in this reading, much of what the director does is that they're just the outside eyes. They just reflect back the choices that are being made and discuss the choices that we hope are being made. And Kathleen was invaluable in that way. But during rehearsals, I said to the company, I said, I am nervous about the playwriting hat is a really different hat than the directing hat. And in rehearsals, I have to be the director primarily. So if you want to change the text, I would like you to ask me, give me the note and say, could you pass it along to the playwright? And it was like, an artifice, but it was fun. But it also protected me from having to do changes on the fly. And so when they would do that, I would look at the text and say, oh, I see how to fix this. Or I would say, you know what? The playwright will look at this at the end of rehearsal today. And when I was fixing it on the fly, sometimes I could do it, but I could never do it and preserve the iambic pentameter. And I was going to say, the playwright can make the change, but the actor and Dawn is going to have to make sense of how it fits into the scansion. And it's an amazing company, and they did that.
Makes sense. Well, I'm sorry to hear that the iambic pentameter got messed up, but not all that sorry.
It should also be said, the poem was written when Milton was blind. He was fully blind. He'd been blind for a decade when he wrote the poem. He dictated the entire thing to his daughters, who transcribed it as his amanuenses. And the poem, unlike any Shakespearean play, is written in perfect iambic pentameter. And I mean, I have looked for an 11-syllable line, and there is nary one in the whole damn thing.
There's not even a feminine. Wow. All right.
Yeah.
No strong onsets. No nothing. Just bump our way through the whole 13 hours.
Amazing. It's amazing.
So an anonymous attendee, as we disappear into iambic pentameter land, an anonymous attendee asks a question. They thought that the ending felt more optimistic and hopeful than you'd expect after being tossed out of paradise into the world we know. Who made that choice?
Milton. That's how Milton ends the play. Michael has an amazing, I don't know, we'll call it a monologue, but Michael has an amazing monologue to Adam and Eve. Right, Michael? How much were you?
I mean, it is, the reason it's not a Revenger's tragedy is because it's not a tragedy. And the impossible story that Milton is trying to say is that they are evicted from paradise and they lose everything. But because of the Son's mercy, they gain some things too, and it's going to be okay. And I mean, I'm getting shivers just thinking about that. The last page and a half, I can't hear it or read it without crying, because it is so, you can't believe that it is hopeful after what they've been through, but it is. And they're going to take care of each other.
It calls to mind for me, this is a nerd hat for me, but it calls to mind the sort of classic trope of fantasy novels of like the reason the human race is the most powerful race is precisely because they are not immortal and they do not live long. So they move fast and they create and they use the time they have and they grow and they evolve and they adapt. And it felt to me watching the end of it that there was the whole thing about gaining wisdom and gaining knowledge and being like there was that piece of me that went, this is actually the beginning. I realized this is also the beginning of a massive religion, but also the beginning of like a fantasy novel of like, now they will go forth and adapt and improve and evolve in a way that they never would have if they had just stayed in paradise the whole time.
Totally. And Nathan, it's so funny that you invoke that genre, because the young adult novel that I'm working on right now, These Precious Stones, is a contemporary epic young adult fantasy novel with queer protagonists. And the privilege of working on the poem and this book at the same time have really been informing each other. And I would make Marvel Comic Universe references all the time in rehearsals that would be greeted with delight or ire with cast members, depending on their familiarity with the movies. But mostly, I think that Avengers Infinity Stones uses Thanos is a Satan figure, and the first half of the poem is almost identical to the first half of that movie. They're using that same structure where the protagonist is the antagonist, and you give that person so much time that we can't help but root for them. And this is sort of Milton's wonderful magic trick, is that we love Satan, and because we love Satan, we understand why Eve would be seduced by him as well as the other angels, because he is so winning.
And Anne adds to this conversation in terms of the poignant end, the blissful solitude of Eden, where Adam and Eve are described as handed they walked, whereas in the poignant end that changes into they hand in hand through Eden took their solitary way.
Yes.
So
yeah, this is
and also Nathan, just to note, one of the most central paradoxes that you've got there. I mean, God wants to get rid of them because he doesn't want them to eat of the next tree, the tree of life, which would be the tree of immortality. So they're banished from Eden into mortality, death, sin, and death, because God doesn't want them to be immortal. God knows what's going on. So it's one of those deep central paradoxes of the poem.
And it's a beautiful, the allegory of it is also so beautiful, because Satan gives birth to sin, and sin gives birth to death. Death is not possible without sin in the Miltonic universe.
So we are starting to trickle towards our end time. So I want to do a little bit of like a speed round. Through some of these.
Lots of short questions.
Yeah. So one of them is not even a question, but worth saying. Recognition of the superb acting, transformation of the facial expressions throughout the reading did as much as the words themselves to convey meaning, message, and magic. So a little bit of a happy one there. And then Robert Brophy, this one might be hard to do quick, but we'll see, has asked if you have ever done this or considered doing it with Comus, Milton's one drama, or Samson Agonistus.
Oh, yes, of course.
Because he'd love to see Delilah and the death of all the Philistines.
But who wouldn't, really? Who wouldn't?
Whoa. No. So anyway, those are your next projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get right on that.
Okay. I actually did, Robert, for what it's worth, when I heard that Milton had written a drama, I did write a note to myself to read Comus. So thank you. I appreciate that.
And Samson.
Yeah. I'm clearly behind in my Miltoning, at least of the dramas. This is from Sally Walton. Milton seems to delight in epic inflation and deflation. For example, depicting Satan tall as a tower and vast as a whale, but chained on a burning lake and totally under God's control, etc. Your version seems to dodge some of those moments of diminishing Satan, with Ithuriel and Zephon, for example, or in the War in Heaven, where we get devilish cannon, but not an angelic bombardment of mountains. Can you discuss that kind of choice?
Oh, cutting the angelic bombardment of mountains was very difficult. There are two things that broke my heart. It was cutting that, and then there's a sequence after Sin escapes hell, where he has a scene with Chaos that is like so beautiful, and cutting that was like, Seussical the Musical. There was a workshop of Seussical the Musical before it was on Broadway that everybody claims to have attended. I did not attend it. And they all talk about the Lorax sequence being so beautiful, but it had to get cut. And that is how I thought about Chaos, as the Lorax sequence of our own version, because I loved it so much, but I had to cut it. There are a few things behind that. The first is that kind of if inflation and deflation of proportion is really hard on stage. And when we imagine doing it on stage, the language will do a lot of the work as long as you don't call attention to the things that the language will never be able to do successfully. So that was part of the mind. The other thing was that what is absolutely essential for the telling of the story. And the war sequence was one of the most difficult sequences to cut because it is huge and it is epic. And I looked at a lot of the war sequences in Shakespeare's histories and tragedies to sort of see how he did it. Shauna Cooper, who's a wonderful Shakespearean director and the wife of Gregory Linnington, who played Beelzebub in our reading, she was also really helpful to me. You know, one of the things that I want to explore further, she did a beautiful production of Julius Caesar. And when I asked her about it, she said, you know, it's a civil war in Julius Caesar, which is really different than an invasion by an outside military force. And this is also a civil war that happens here. So I continue to think about how the rebel angels and the loyal angels know each other. And that kind of intimacy leads to a really different kind of warfare than an external invasion, for example.
Would you stage battles on a stage version?
Yeah, I have this idea that in the first part, the battle is sort of this huge spectacle that is choreographed and stylized, and it sort of anchors the piece. And in the second half, there's a dump show when Raphael recounts everything that has happened in the first part of the poem. And although the style of that would be different, it would serve a similar function.
Awesome. See, well, if anybody is looking for a adaptation, world premiere adaptation of a title recognized play with 12 actors over 4.5 hours that also has a large stylized battle,
exactly.
Call Michael.
Under 4 hours. Thank you. Under 4 hours.
Under 4 hours.
Yeah.
But the great. And Anne McDonald also confirms that Comus is great. So now I definitely have to read it. Thank you, Robert, for letting us know about that. And adding another thing to my list of things to read. No, that's great. And and my artistic director tells me that we actually did a Revelation reading of Samson and Agonistus a few years back with Robert Cuccioli in the title role and directed by Michael Sexton at the Lortel. So Red Bull's done it. It's just before my time because I'm a baby. So there you go, Robert. Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, and I think we are coming a little bit towards the end. So unless any of you have anything, any final comments that you want to say, Anne has left us with the beautiful, but they will look forward to a paradise within the happier far, which is a beautiful final thought about what that play was about, which is a place where I'm very happy to leave it if all of you are.
Sure.
Wonderful. Well, then, I'm going to now tell them about things upcoming at Red Bull. You're welcome to stick around for 3 minutes, but you do not have to. Thank you all for coming. Once again, Paradise Lost Part 2 can still be seen until tomorrow at 7 p.m. and then it's gone. So if you only saw the first part and didn't realize there was a second part, you've got until tomorrow at 7 to watch that. That's on the Red Bull YouTube page or on the Red Bull page. Also, if you have enjoyed tonight's programming, please check out our upcoming reading on May 17th of Ben Jonson's basically never performed Roman tragedy, Sejanus, His Fall, starring Dennis O'Hare, Keith David, Tamara Tooney, and more, and directed by yours truly, so you know it'll be okay. And finally, all of our programming this year is absolutely free, and that is only possible with the support of people like you. So if you are able, please do consider making a tax-deductible donation to Red Bull Theater today. That's all for tonight. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to click end, and it'll be really sudden, so